What is the most severe case of someone being completely out of touch with reality you've ever seen? Alright, so this is a story about the first hearing I ever attended. My adversary was represented by an established solo attorney from a different state. Let's call him Dude. I had spoken to him a few times over the phone before and considered him a competent and passionate advocate. I met Dude at the courthouse with co-counsel, I'm a woman, and so is she, to basically pass the time while waiting for trial call. The first thing Dude says is, "Hi." The second thing he says is, "I gotta show you a picture of my wife, okay?" Now, Dude is in his early 60s, small, and bald. He takes out his phone and shows us a photo of this young girl who, according to him, is 20 but looks about 15. He then tells us she's from Dominica. As we're standing there staring at him, he unpromptedly launches into a story about going to the mall with her and how she begged him to buy her stuff while calling him Daddy. Apparently, Dude thought we would be impressed. Spoiler, we were not impressed. My mother and father were given $20,000 by my grandparents in 1965. With that money, they were able to buy a house. Fast forward 50 years, my mother gave me and my sisters $10,000 each. She couldn't understand why we couldn't buy houses with the money like she did, and she accused us of not being good with money. At the time, she was sitting on a significant amount of money in the bank and was fully aware that houses in her neighborhood now cost around $1 million, 100 times the amount she gave us and 50 times what her parents gave her 50 years earlier. God, if only I could be as good with money as she was. Not saying that $10,000 wasn't appreciated. Just pointing out that she expected us to somehow become her neighbors while completely ignoring inflation, giving us half of what she received, and fully knowing the current value of her house. Parents of a 35-year-old woman who had been hospitalized after suffering severe anoxic brain damage 20 years ago. She had remained in the same ward ever since, barely conscious. For 20 years, they refused to transfer her to a more suitable facility, insisting that there was no reason to do so. They believed those facilities were for lost causes, and were convinced that their daughter was going to make a full recovery, finish school, get married, and be totally fine. Working in hospitals, I've come across quite a collection of stories like this, but this one has always stood out as one of the saddest. I'm a mental health therapist who works with severe mental health diagnoses such as schizophrenia, so I've met many people who aren't in touch with reality. But I'm assuming the question is more about people who seem to have their wits about them yet are completely unaware of the realities of life. I have a sad one. My female cousin, who was very shy, nice, but not popular, was getting married. She didn't attend many family events or build close relationships with anyone, and she was marrying a man very similar to her, just quieter. Her family was fairly well off, and her older brother had just had a huge, expensive wedding with about 200 guests. Even though she specifically asked for a small wedding, her parents invited all these extended family members, acquaintances, etc., and despite not receiving RSVPs back, they still went all out on the venue, food, and entertainment. The groom's side was similar, reserved, wanting a small wedding, and without much of a social circle. When the wedding day came, only about 10 to 15 guests showed up to a venue set up for over 150 people, complete with an open bar, which the bride and groom didn't drink from. Both were extremely embarrassed, and the day was completely ruined for them due to how awkward and quiet everything was. My immediate family wasn't invited. My family has its own issues, but that's another story, but I've always felt bad for her. Neither the bride nor groom were bad people, they were just reserved and private. Their parents' obliviousness to their wishes turned what should have been a special day into a really uncomfortable memory. On a brighter note, a few years later, after building successful careers and coming out of their social shells, they had a beautiful, intimate renewal of vows in a stunning location with select friends and family. It seemed to make up for the original wedding in some way. I used to watch a streamer a couple of times, but his behavior quickly drove me to stop. It was a shame because when he was actually gaming, the content was enjoyable. However, his attitude, mostly constant raging, was unbearable. Back when I stopped watching, the rest of the events I'm about to mention hadn't happened yet. The part that really shows how out of touch with reality he is involved his so-called girlfriend. He would talk about her on stream, which isn't unusual, except that his girlfriend was a female streamer from Europe, while he lived in the US, and they'd never even met in real life. Eventually, she found out through shared viewers and debunked his claims on her own stream, saying she had never interacted with him. This caused him to completely lose it. He began stalking her wherever he could online, harassing her to the point where she eventually quit streaming, deleted all her social media, and essentially disappeared. After his Twitch account was banned for this behavior, he somehow convinced Twitch to unban him. Then, he repeated the same thing with a different female streamer. This time, Twitch permanently banned his account. Now, he spends his time raging about the ban on Twitter. For the record, I don't follow this guy, but people occasionally post updates about him on game subreddits, which is how I know about the story. Some people are just completely out of touch with reality. My old boss at the time was a 26-year-old woman who got $4 million a year from her mom to play with. Her mom is very wealthy in China, and the daughter was here trying to be the CEO of a company just for fun. I accidentally ended up getting a job at that company. One day, she announced that we were all going on a group outing for bonding. She took the 7 of us to an outlet mall 4 hours away. When we got there, she told us she was going to go shop and would see us later, which was code for, "Don't follow me, guys." Every 2 hours, she would text the group saying she was heading to the giant rented van to unload her bags and that we could meet her there to unload ours as well. Of course, the rest of us, who were making under $50,000 a year, had nothing to unload. By lunchtime, she had filled up the entire van with her purchases. Then she asked me where all my new stuff was, and I told her I was budgeting right now. She said, "Take out a credit card and go shop. That's the American way." Seriously. Okay. By 9 p.m., her bags were taking up people's seats, and they had to sit with her stuff. She spent $30,000 that day. The rest of us? We spent about $70 total. We were tired, bored, and cold. To this day, I still believe she thinks she did something nice for us and doesn't understand how polarizing and completely not team bonding that experience was. So I grew up with a lot of restrictions that, at the time, I had no idea weren't normal. For example, I was only allowed 2 options for shoes, but the catch was that I had to make the right choice. Or that I could make friends on my own without being told, "This is your new friend, now go play with them." Sadly, my dad kept me in a small box, and he was the only one allowed to control what went into that box or came out of it. When I was 10, Child Protective Services got involved, and I was taken into foster care. That's when my world exploded. I didn't truly understand how bad it had been until they took me to a shoe store and told me to pick out the ones I liked. I swear, for the life of me, I had no clue what to do. I stood there for what felt like hours until they noticed and asked me what my favorite color was. I said green because that was what my father had told me I liked. But I guess I was too overwhelmed, and I just remember saying yes to everything. I ended up with ugly brown and pink sneakers. What most children learn to do at a normal age, I am only just figuring out in my 20s. Reality was hard to live in because, the whole time, I was stuck in my dream world. I had a neighbor once who was convinced I was flirting with him and wanted to be with him. He got all of this from the one-word exchanges we would have while getting our mail, which was basically just saying, "Hi." At the time, I was a minor in high school, and he was probably well into his 20s. He proceeded to harass and stalk me. Some examples: he messaged me on Facebook, declaring his love for me and accusing me of playing hard to get. He would knock on our house door, always when he knew my parents weren't home, and tried to lure me outside so he could talk to me. He searched me up on all my social media accounts, using my last name from the mailbox to track me down and contact me. It didn't help that we lived in the same building. I became so scared that I could no longer go outside for a run like I usually did. I filed a police report, and his family approached mine, asking us to forgive their son. That completely freaked me out, and my family decided to move. There's a guy I knew whose brain is completely fried, and his perception of everything is just distorted, to put it lightly. I know people who have known him for a long time, before he became the way he is, and I've heard different stories about what happened. The most common ones are that he did a really nasty, toxic shot of meth and never came back from it, or he just did way too much too fast over a period of time and it messed him up. Either way, it was caused by heavy drug abuse. It's hard to describe the way he is. He's not your typical strung-out meth head, He's really soft-spoken most of the time but says and does random, incomprehensible things. He has these weird habits, like sitting and staring at you for literally minutes on end without blinking, standing in front of a mirror and mumbling to himself, having severe mood swings, and outbursts brought on by hallucinations. I think he's still in jail right now, but before that, he was sleeping in a tent out in the woods near his family's house. They wouldn't let him stay with them, not just because of the way he is but also because they're a bunch of selfish tweakers themselves. He's a really nice guy most of the time, he just struggles to keep people's company and get their help. Unfortunately, the people he associates with aren't the type to help him anyway since he has nothing to offer in return. It's a pretty shitty thing to see, and I hope he's able to find some sort of stability someday. The majority of people ordering to go from restaurants right now are wild. I had a woman scream at me over the phone because her medium-rare steak had blood pouring out of the container. I had to put her on hold because I couldn't stop laughing. Another woman called me a fucking asshole because she thought I slammed the phone on her. I didn't, I was just busy. I apologized anyway, and she said, "That's not good enough." A guy came back with his entire to-go order, which he must have eaten outside, and dumped it all over the bar. Not kidding. Then there was the guy who asked for a Long Island iced tea. After we explained we weren't offering that right now, he said he'd break into our liquor room and make it himself. He actually came in, and we had to call the cops. And these are just a few examples. At the risk of giving an answer that's too real, my grandmother with Alzheimer's. We're at the stage now where it's basically a given that she's not aware of what's going on. She'll ask about people who aren't there, reference things that didn't happen, or get upset because she's late for something that occurred years ago. Don't get me wrong, it's hard, but it's nowhere near as hard as it was a few years back. Now, it's easier to deal with, mostly because it's easier to disregard what she's saying, and we're all better practiced at it. A few years ago, when she didn't remember my name for the first time or when she recognized that she should know me but was lucid enough to try and hide the fact that she didn't, that was much harder. These days, it's safe to say she's not very in touch with our modern reality, but she's still very friendly, and I feel like I have a duty to make sure she's not lonely or scared. My stepbrother got involved with a strange Gnostic religious group and believed he could convert people by talking to them, harassing them, in a Socratic style, except he had no ability to carry on a philosophical conversation. He also thought the workplace was the perfect setting for this. When he inevitably got fired from his temp jobs, he assumed it was part of a conspiracy against enlightenment. On a funny note, one of the group's activities was rewriting their religious book by hand, which he diligently did. The book wasn't small either. Turns out he used the wrong color ink, which for some reason invalidated the whole thing. Got a job as a waiter at a restaurant. For some unimaginable reason, he thought waiters were supposed to bow after taking orders. When his supervisor asked him to stop, he gave them a lecture on proper waitstaff manners. Decided he wanted to propose to a woman in her 50s who had shown no signs of being interested in him. Thankfully, he believed in the tradition of asking the father's permission first, so he approached his dad, who talked him out of it. Came up with the idea to join the military to convert soldiers from the inside. At one point, believed the sun's rays could sustain him, but fortunately, he never bothered to actually practice it. Is completely against capitalism and wants to live a free life as a wandering philosopher rather than be a working drone like everyone else. However, he also thinks the working drones in his family should support his noble pursuit, all while chastising them for selling out. I used to work at a software company in downtown Boston. One of the best perks of the job was the flexibility in hours. Many people had regular work-from-home days. Personally, I could drop my kids off at school, get into the office by 9:30, and my boss had no issue with it whatsoever. Others with kids had similar arrangements, arriving late or leaving early depending on their childcare needs. After a few years, a new CEO came in. She spent about a month observing how the office operated and then called for a company-wide meeting. During the meeting, she announced that she believed having a full office from 8 to 5 was the most productive environment. Starting the next month, all work-from-home privileges were cancelled, and everyone was required to be in the office during those hours. No more arriving late or leaving early. A lively debate followed. People expressed concerns about the lack of warning, pleaded for flexibility, and pointed out the challenges of arranging childcare, especially given that some schedules, like school drop-offs and pickups, couldn't be adjusted. On top of that, commuting into Boston is notoriously awful. After listening to all these arguments, she responded with a long speech about how she appreciated the sacrifices everyone had to make to better the company, how everyone needed to do their part, and so on. She ended by saying, "I understand where you're all coming from. Years ago, when my kids were little, my husband and I had to hire 3 nannies to cover all the times we had to work. I remember looking around the room at everyone else, and we were all speechless. That was the moment I realized I needed to start looking for another job." When a millionaire CEO thinks hiring 3 nannies is a relatable example for her middle-class employees, it's pretty clear she's not going to change her mind. A friend of my husband's from college recently went through a messy divorce. The marriage was kind of a sham from the beginning. The girl only wanted to marry him because her religious parents wouldn't let them live together unless they were married. However, she was clearly in love with someone else and even invited that person into their marriage as a third. That arrangement might work for some, but it didn't seem like our friend was particularly on board. They eventually got divorced, and now she lives with the third person and seems very happy. But the whole situation seems to have broken something in our friend. He now spends literally all day posting on Facebook about ridiculous conspiracy theories, airing private details about his relationship with his ex-wife for everyone to see, and accusing her of things like emotional rape, which, according to him, is worse than regular rape. He'll also post the same thing over and over, like I've seen him share the same fake conspiracy article over 30 times in a row within 10 minutes. When Bernie Sanders dropped out of the presidential race, he went off and started threatening to take the lives of anyone planning to vote for Biden. He made so many threats that someone called the cops on him. The most recent wild incident was when he saw a picture on his ex-wife's page of her garden, where she used a couple of wire panels to prop up some green beans. Apparently, those wire panels were from some sort of business they tried to start together, and he had a full meltdown. He even had a conversation with himself in the comments of his own post about how her using those panels was a betrayal and how she was taunting him with them. It's pretty clear he's not handling the situation well. My dad has always been in terrible shape. Diabetes, intestinal issues, severely underweight, multiple organ removals, arrests, homelessness, you name it. In his eyes, none of it was his fault. Drugs and alcohol, according to him, had nothing to do with his problems. It was always someone else's fault. Most of the time, he blamed the military, from his time serving in Desert Storm. While I don't know how much army life contributed to his health problems, his strict diet of Twinkies, malt liquor, and cocaine certainly didn't help. Dad dragged me into a lot of his issues, but things spiraled out of control when his behavior caused him to lose his house. He lost his house because he failed to pay the mortgage. Not because he didn't have the money, but because he was too busy partying to care. He blamed his wife at the time, who had tried so hard to help him but couldn't take it anymore and divorced him after the house was gone. Not Dad's fault, her fault. Next, he had a house being built for him through Habitat for Humanity. With Habitat, the house isn't just handed to you, you need to put in some work hours. The rep let me work on his behalf because Dad couldn't handle much physical labor. Dad was supposed to do some easier work at their store, like painting trim. Then one day, he called me saying Habitat had ripped him off and taken the house. I called the rep, who explained that whenever they picked him up, he was too intoxicated to bring to the store. She had warned him multiple times and even had a serious talk with him about his drinking. He got angry and refused to change, so they had no choice but to cut him off. Not Dad's fault, Habitat's fault. Then he rented a duplex. He trashed it like he always did, buying dogs he couldn't care for, leaving dog poop everywhere, and eventually giving the dogs away. He started asking me for money for groceries, which I gave him even though it strained me financially. Meanwhile, expensive liquor bottles littered his place. When I asked why he didn't buy groceries before splurging on 30-year-old whiskey, he got angry. Not Dad's fault, my fault. The landlord of the duplex, a retired airman, had given Dad a great deal out of sympathy for a fellow soldier. But Dad destroyed the place. The landlord was patient, even offering to arrange for a cleaning service and spread the cost over small rent increases. Dad, intoxicated, got angry and refused. Eventually, he was evicted. When I cleaned out the place, the landlord explained everything to me. I could only nod and apologize because Dad's behavior left nothing to defend. Not Dad's fault, the landlord's fault. After that, Dad moved in with Grandpa, who doesn't tolerate alcohol in his house. This led to constant battles. Grandpa eventually told me he couldn't handle Dad anymore. So, we contacted a nearby veterans home. They were understanding but required Dad to go to rehab first. Grandpa's inability to deal with him. Not Dad's fault, Grandpa's fault. Dad hated the idea of rehab. He ranted about how the veterans home was a prison, how rehab was for junkies, and how everyone was out to get him. After he finally wore himself out, I told him, "We're all exhausted, including you. We're not playing games anymore. Your two options are to address your substance abuse or die. Make a choice, because the vet's home is waiting for you to contact them." I walked away, done with his excuses. A while later, Grandpa called me. For a moment, I thought he was calling to say Dad had died. All I could think was, thank God it's over. But no, Dad had agreed to go to rehab. Begrudgingly, resentfully, but he went. At this point, nothing was his fault. It was everyone else's fault. Dad had been to rehab before, but this time, something changed. He finally admitted he had a substance problem. He blamed it on the military and PTSD, which I don't completely dismiss. But the reason he joined the military in the first place was to avoid prison after multiple DUIs and drug-related offenses. Drugs and alcohol were an issue long before the military. Still, the most important thing was that he finally admitted his behavior was out of control. There's a happy ending. He's now living at the vet's home and doing much better. He's gained weight, he used to look skeletal. The vet's home is amazing. They take residents fishing, to sporting events, concerts, and golf outings. The food is nutritious and delicious, there are recreational areas, and the staff are incredible. Dad is visibly happier and healthier. He even volunteers as a counselor for terminal patients at the facility. It took a long time and a lot of pain, but he's finally in a good place. We'll call him Lee. I worked at a rather swanky restaurant for a year. A month or so after I was hired, another guy joined the team named Lee. Lee was the saddest sack of a human being any of us had ever met, and we had no idea how he had survived this long, let alone how he was ever hired or managed to last as an employee. The first thing to know about Lee is that he was a hardcore gambling addict. The second thing is that he was in the middle of a divorce but refused to sign the papers. The third thing is that he believed his entire family, along with his stripper wife, was out to get him. If you weren't already aware of all this, don't worry, Lee would tell you himself within 5 minutes of meeting him. I've never met someone so openly delusional in my life. How he got hired was beyond comprehension, and he quickly became our favorite after-work drinks topic. Lee walked up to everyone at work and incessantly talked about how he was going to win the lottery. Every single day. Without fail. He constantly begged people for money, yes, at his job, claiming he needed it for lotto tickets. One coworker gave him a few bucks once just to shut him up, and I gave that coworker a serious talking to about enabling him. Lee would complain endlessly about how his family wouldn't talk to him and were out for his house. He played the victim, but it was clear his family was just done with his antics and trying to protect him from financial ruin while saving the family house, which he lived in but couldn't afford. Lee was the most frustrating person to be around and got yelled at by his colleagues constantly. His sob story grew old fast, and he'd approach people to dump his personal problems on them without prompting. He begged for favors like a spoiled 12-year-old, and his financial recklessness was astonishing. He was hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt and spent his first paycheck on lotto tickets. Once, Lee came up to me to talk about his plan for financial freedom. My coworker and I pulled out a calculator and broke down his odds of hitting his scratch card dream. The absurdly tiny fraction didn't faze him. It was like showing a Westworld host a picture of a nuclear missile. He simply didn't process it and went right back to talking about the lottery. He never shut up. Lee was a mix of astonishment, hilarity, and secondhand depression for the entire time he worked there. Finally, after about 6 months, the gambling addict got caught, drumroll, stealing money. Quite mild compared to some of the stories here, but my college classmate comes to mind. Let's call him R. R is a textbook case of the sheltered rich kid who has no grasp of the real world. R started his college life by casually using racial slurs and swearing at people, apparently thinking that was okay. Unsurprisingly, it was not. He was reported several times before he finally got the message and stopped. Okay, at least he stopped, right? Problem solved? Not quite. R has since declared that he'll have no problem buying a house, despite the ongoing housing crisis, and insists his first job must pay him a £50,000 salary, or he'll kill himself. He seems completely unaware that most first jobs start at the bottom of the hierarchy, and a £50,000 starting salary is extremely rare. R also believes it will be very easy to become an English teacher in Japan. His logic? You just fly over and speak English, and they'll hire you. He hasn't thought about the fact that teaching jobs often require, a teaching degree. He also hasn't considered that other people might want to become English teachers in Japan, meaning he'd face competition for those positions. Back in the day, my wealthy uncle and his wife often had helpful offers and suggestions. When my partner and I were expecting a baby, the pregnancy complicated an undiagnosed spinal cord injury, causing me terrible, debilitating symptoms. I needed to see specialists but couldn't afford it. Eventually, I could no longer work, and with over half our income gone, it became a high-risk pregnancy. My aunt and uncle contacted me with an offer to pay for a real wedding. When I explained that what we really needed was money for doctors, rent, and food, they declined to help but added, "There's always a lot of good food left over after a wedding." A couple of years later, my uncle suggested I try buying a used car. "You should try certified pre-owned. People may notice it's old, but some are just $15,000. He couldn't comprehend that I'd never owned a car less than 10 years old or spent more than $5,000 on one. In his mind, only cars from dealerships were reliable. My roommate in LA didn't understand the concept of a shared apartment. Month after month, I cleaned the kitchen, washed the dishes, and cleaned the bathroom and living room. After 7 months, I finally asked him to clean up once. He asked me, why? I explained that we both shared the apartment and that I had been cleaning for half a year and just wanted him to do it once. He got mad, cleaned for about 2 minutes, and then said he was done. He's very sheltered. He had never cooked a meal before I taught him how to make scrambled eggs or an egg and bacon sandwich. At his parents' house, he would just leave things like clothes, trash, or dishes on the floor, couch, or dining table, and his mom would clean up after him without complaint for over 20 years. His dad is a successful business owner who covers all his finances. One time, he was late on rent, so I covered it. When I told him, he said I should have waited until his dad gave him the money. I explained that rent was due on the 1st and considered late afterward, and if we waited too long, we'd get an eviction notice or late fees. He argued that it shouldn't apply to him since he had the money, it was just that his dad forgot to give it to him. Later, I found out he told all our friends that I was the one late on rent all the time and that I was lazy about paying. Luckily, my friends know me well and could spot the flaws and discrepancies in his stories. They also know he's essentially a baby in an adult's body. Almost none of my friends talk to him anymore, except for a few who are similarly sheltered but not as bad as he is. I was married to my partner of 10 years. He had a high salary, while I worked for a charity and didn't earn much. When I became planned, we both agreed I would leave work for a few years to care for our child, as it made little financial difference to us due to his high income. Our deposit for our first home came mostly from his savings because of his salary. Shortly after our daughter was born, he left us for a work colleague. I had no job and a newborn to care for. He assumed that, since he had paid the deposit, he could sell our family home and start his new life as if we didn't exist. He told his lawyer there was no reason why my baby and I couldn't move into a rented flat somewhere. He even sent over a list of terrible one-bedroom flats in awful, unsafe areas that he considered suitable. 2 years later, my daughter and I have been granted the house. He is now legally required to pay the mortgage as well as child and spousal maintenance. He currently lives in a rented flat with the woman he left us for, who is also incredibly detached from reality, but that's a whole other story. He genuinely believed he could abandon his wife and newborn, leave us with nothing, and seamlessly start a new life with a new home while we struggled to scrape by. My friend stole my card information and bought loads of expensive stuff. Before reporting it, I asked her if it was her, knowing that A, she was going through a tough time, and I wanted to give her a chance to make it right, and B, I could get in trouble for conspiracy to commit fraud if I reported it and they thought I was involved by having stuff delivered to her to claim the money back. She denied it, so I thought someone else must have done it and reported the fraud. When she got arrested, she said she didn't think they'd take the fraud thing so far. She genuinely believed you could just call up banks, get the money back, and that they wouldn't investigate. My cousin was spoiled and sheltered her entire childhood through college. Then her parents, without any preparation, just let her loose into society. She quickly got into trouble for bouncing checks all over town. My mom picked her up and asked her why she was writing bad checks everywhere. It turns out my cousin believed that as long as you had checks in your checkbook, you had money in your account. She didn't understand the basic concept that you deposit money into an account and can only spend or withdraw up to that amount. Please teach your kids basic finance. Note, this was in 1996, so let's not turn this into a "who writes checks anymore" discussion. I had a 50-year-old coworker who had been an artist her entire life, living off her rich husband and her paintings. When they broke up, she had to apply for a job for the first time in her life and ended up working in customer service with us, handling phone operations. She had absolutely no idea how to work in an office or interact with colleagues. Once, she went to sleep at her desk for a full hour because she was tired and didn't realize that was inappropriate. Another time, she left stinky cheese on the table by the printer in the corridor because she didn't want to put it in the fridge. She lost her driver's license due to terrible driving skills and started arriving 1 or 2 hours late every day because she refused to take the earlier train, saying she didn't want to sit and wait if she arrived too early. She somehow managed to erase a product from our system, which caused chaos for 2 days, and she couldn't understand why it was such a big deal. When her contract wasn't extended, she thought it was because the company was extra weird and confidently believed she'd find another job easily. Needless to say, she went back to painting. I did feel some pity for her, she was so clueless, but I was also relieved when she left. Poor thing. Over dinner one night, my father casually told me that, over the 36 years he had been married to my mother, he had never loved her. He was willing to give up his family, his 4 adult children, and his wife just to run away with a woman he had met 40 years ago. He announced his plan to file for divorce, quit his job, and move out in a week, leaving my mother with the mortgage and bills. Apparently, all his responsibilities were no longer his problem. The catch? Until he left, he was still living in the house with my mother and 2 of my adult siblings. While he was there, he started spinning tall tales to turn the family against one another. In his version of events, he was the victim in all of this. He blamed the divorce on my siblings, explained away quitting his job as their fault, and denied ever having abused me growing up. None of that happened. I never hit him, he claimed. My family called me to confirm what had really happened. They knew he was lying, especially since his narrative made no sense. He insisted everyone was making it up and that we were imagining the days when I had black eyes and bruises. His excuse: I was bullied in school. Bitch, I was homeschooled. My partner and I helped my mom find a divorce attorney and started the arduous process of getting her through the divorce.